put it all together and you start to see why we have an issue with obesity in this country, especially when you consider the fact that the average caloric intake in the United States is over 3,500 calories per day, and the average physical activity is less than 20 minutes. Calorie intakes are based on self-reported questionnaires, and those are notoriously inaccurate. Obese people on average tend to underreport their food intake by about 50%. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Dr. Layne Norton podcast. I am your host, you guessed it, Layne Norton. And this week we are having our first research deep dive. So every few episodes, I want to take a study that I think is really cool and deep dive it with you guys, break it down in a way that's easy to understand, give you some practical takeaways, and walk you through the research process so that you guys can understand this better, so that I'm not just like spoon feeding you information. I want to teach you a methodology of thinking so that in the future, if you see a study that interests you, you can actually go read it and hopefully get something out of it. Now, if you guys enjoy these kinds of breakdowns, you're going to want to make sure you're subscribed to my research review reps. Every single month, we review 5 studies that are popular in fitness and nutrition and health, and we break them down in a way that is palatable and easy to understand for anybody, even if you don't have a science degree. So we're going to tell you what the problem is, what the background of the problem is, why it's a problem, how the researchers tested it, what the researchers found, and what it means for you. And if we disagree with their interpretation of their own data, we will tell you. So it's a critical analysis. It's a practical analysis. It's not just a bunch of mumbo jumbo using big words to sound smart. We're breaking it down in a way that's easy to understand. So if you're interested in enhancing your brain and body gains, make sure you subscribe to Reps. You can find the link in the show notes. So for our first research breakdown, of course, we're looking at something to do with protein, but not just protein, high protein diets in the context of ultra-processed foods. So this is a really cool study because it's looking at something that I don't really think has ever been examined before. So the title of the study is Short-Term Effects of High Protein, Lower Carbohydrate Ultra-Processed Foods on Human Energy Balance. We know that ultra-processed foods are a risk factor for a lot of disease, and I'm going to get into why. We also know that high-protein diets have certain advantages, but to date, there haven't really been many studies, this is the first study I'm aware of, looking at, okay, if we feed ultra-processed diets, but with high protein, how does that affect things? Because most diets that are high in ultra-processed foods are relatively low in protein in terms of a contributor as a percentage of energy. If you think about your normal ultra-processed foods, chips, sweets, packaged foods, most of them have a lot of energy from carbohydrate and fat, but not a lot of energy from protein. So one of the questions I think research scientists have, and I certainly have, is this an effect of the processing, of the ultra processing, of the energy density of the food? Or is it an effect of these people aren't getting very much protein, and so maybe that's having an effect on satiety? So in order to better familiarize you guys with scientific papers, I am going to go through breaking things down through each section of the scientific paper. So most scientific papers have a few different sections. They have an introduction, which is where they introduce the problem and maybe state a hypothesis. And they're giving you a lot of background information and what has been tested so far about this topic. Then they're going to go through the methods, which is, this is how we set up to test what we wanted to test. Then they're going to give you the results, which is just straightforward reporting. Here's the data. Here's what we found. Then there's the discussion. And the discussion is going to be talking about the results in the context of the things that were discussed in the introduction. So basically, how does this fit with the other research literature that's out there? What do they think it means? And basically, the authors will get a chance to state their opinion about their own data, and they will put in their conclusion based on their data as it fits within the context of the other literature. Now, I want to be very, very clear here. When it comes to conclusions, conclusions are essentially the opinion of the author. And I have read many papers where I disagreed with the author's conclusion based on their own data. So I think it's important to point out a lot of people will go online, they'll pull up an abstract, they'll read the conclusion, and they'll go, ah. And listen, I want to applaud anyone who's willing to look up scientific research papers and try to educate themselves. I think that's a very, very noble thing. But if you're just going to pull up a paper and look at the conclusion of the last line, is it better than going on YouTube and getting all your information from there? Yeah, probably. But you can almost always find a study that will have a conclusion to back up whatever you wish to believe to be true. So it is important to be able to understand, at least on a basic level, how to interpret some of this stuff. So I'm hoping that by listening or watching this podcast, I'm going to equip you with tools to where you can do more than just read an abstract and look at the conclusion, to where you can actually look at, okay, how did they test it? Does this make sense for the question they wanted to answer? I think one of the things to really point out is research studies can have conclusions, but many times the research study is not set up to appropriately, one, ask the right question, two, it is not appropriate and designed to answer the question, and three, even if those two things are in place, many times authors don't necessarily understand their own data or how it fits with the consensus with the data. Now, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. I think most research studies do a pretty good job of this, but science and the scientific method, while perfect in its design, is done by humans. And humans, sadly, are imperfect, myself included. So with all that out of the way, let's go through the paper. So first, we're going to go through the introduction. Let's talk about what the problem is and why it needs to be addressed. So many of you are familiar with ultra-processed foods. You've heard about them in the news. You've seen research papers or people on social media talking about them. Ultra-processed foods is basically what it sounds like. Foods that have been through a lot of processing. And in a way, the term ultra-processed is a little bit subjective. I'm not aware of really hard, objective ways that it's quantified. Maybe there are some. But essentially, you're looking at like prepackaged foods. If you want a basic idea of how to identify it, I like to think about what Professor Mark Haub referred to as the 7-Eleven diet. And this is back when he did his own case study where he ate 1,800 calories a day, but from all processed foods, and lost weight and all his blood markers improved. And it's beyond the scope of this discussion, but I like his definition. You know, if it's in a package at 7-Eleven, it's probably going to fit the definition of ultra-processed. I think a lot of you are familiar with the fact that ultra-processed foods have been tied to the obesity crisis. In fact, some people blame ultra-processed foods exclusively for the obesity crisis, or they blame the food processing for the obesity crisis. Now, I'm going to get into this a little bit more later, but I want to be very clear on my stance. Ultra-processed foods absolutely contribute to the obesity crisis for no other reason other than they make food extremely energy dense, meaning more calories per gram. They make it extremely hyperpalatable. It tastes really good, and it has low satiety, so you don't get full easily. And it's very, very cheap. And those four factors absolutely contribute to the obesity crisis. So just on a population level, every 10% increase in calories from ultra-processed food is associated with a 7% increase in the risk of developing obesity. So that's a pretty close correlation right there. And in my opinion, this increased risk is completely explained by the fact that these people consume more calories when they consume more ultra-processed foods. And there's quite a bit of research data to back this up. There was a really well-known study conducted by Kevin Hall at the NIH where they took people who were on a minimally processed food diet and switched them to an ultra-processed food diet. And basically overnight, spontaneously, these folks increased their caloric intake by about 500 calories per day. That is a massive increase in calories. And they weren't telling them to overconsume them. They just told them for both diets, hey, consume what you want, essentially. They call it ad libitum, which means as much as the person wants. And so if you are telling people to consume ad libitum, a minimally processed diet, they decrease their calorie intake compared to an ultra-processed diet. If they switch from a minimally processed diet to an ultra-processed diet, their caloric intake will go up. And it makes a lot of sense as to why, especially when you look at the energy density of ultra-processed foods compared to minimally processed foods. UPFs, or ultra-processed foods, have basically double the energy density of minimally processed foods. So on a per gram basis, on average, minimally processed foods have about 1.1 calories per gram of food. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, well, hang on, 1 calorie per gram, that doesn't make sense because protein is 4 calories per gram, carbohydrates 4 calories per gram, fats 9 calories per gram. How can it be 1.1 calories per gram? Well, that's because food isn't 100% by weight macronutrients. There's a lot of other things in food that don't have energy and don't have calories. So again, minimally processed foods are about 1.1 calorie per gram of food. Ultra processed foods are 2.2 calories per gram of food. Now I want to let that sink in. So if I have somebody eat a kilo of food from minimally processed foods, they're going to get just over 1,000 calories in per day on average. If I have somebody eat a kilogram of food from an ultra-processed diet, they're getting in on average 2,200 calories per day. Same weight of food, but double the calories. Now here's the real rub as well. Minimally processed foods cost about 3 times as much as ultra-processed foods on average. In my opinion, this is why obesity tends to, target lower income areas compared to more affluent. Now, there's probably an educational component as well, but people who have less money, when you can get tastier food that has more calories for less money, that's a pretty big incentive to eat ultra-processed foods compared to minimally processed foods. So you take all these factors together, the increased energy density, the low cost, the low satiety, the fact that people tend to overeat them, you put it all together and you start to see why we have an issue with obesity in this country, especially when you consider the fact that the average caloric intake in the United States is over 3,500 calories per day, and the average physical activity is less than 20 minutes. Now, I know a lot of people will hear those numbers and be very shocked. And you can find other statistics that say the calorie intake is lower. But those calorie intakes are based on self-reported questionnaires, food recall logs, and those are notoriously inaccurate. Now, why are they inaccurate? Well, people tend to underreport their food intake. If you look at obese people on average tend to underreport their food intake by about 50%. There's a very classic study from 1992. I believe the title is Discrepancy Between Self-Reported and Actual Calorie Intake in Obese or Self-Identified Weight Loss Resistant Subjects, I think is the title. And this study basically tracked people in what they ate in a metabolic ward, meaning they were looking directly at how much energy they were consuming as well as how much energy they were expending. They could directly measure these things. But they had people track their intakes themselves. And on average, these folks reported that they were eating 1,200 calories a day. But the research found that they were eating over 1,800 calories per day on average. And they overreported their physical activity by 47%. And when they looked at their metabolic rates, their total daily energy expenditure, they were completely normal. They did not have slow metabolisms. They didn't have lower energy expenditure throughout the day compared to people who weren't obese. Hey guys, Lane here. And if you listen to my podcast, you probably love my research breakdowns. I don't put in a bunch of unnecessary fluff and scientific mumbo jumbo. I just give you the straight facts, but keep the nuance. And so if you love my research breakdowns, you'll love my research review reps. Research explained with practical summaries. Every month, my team of experts breaks down 5 studies in nutrition and fitness in a way that is palatable and easy to understand, even if you don't have a scientific degree. We tell you what the researchers tested, how they tested it, what they found, and what it means for you. And if we disagree with the researchers' conclusions based on their own data, we'll also tell you that. There's no BS, there's no fluff. We give you the straight facts. So if you're looking to up-level your brain and body gains, click the link in the show notes. So people do a really poor job of reporting their food intake accurately. And I don't even necessarily think it's people lying. I think people have a really poor understanding of what a portion size looks like. I mean, if you want to be depressed, go weigh out a serving of peanut butter. I promise you'll be like, oh my God. Like if you're used to like doing a tablespoon and you look at how much a serving size by weight of peanut butter is, chances are when you've been eating a tablespoon of peanut butter, you were eating 2 to 3 times as much as that. If you're having a bowl of ice cream, I promise you, even a small bowl of ice cream to look like the bowl is full, you're going to probably have at least 2 servings of ice cream. A bowl of cereal, I mean, if you fill up a bowl of cereal, you're probably looking at 3 to 4 times the number of servings that's listed on the box. So I don't necessarily think it's lying. I think people are very poor estimators of portion sizes, and they also don't remember their licks, bites, snacks. They have a really hard time recalling it after the fact. People tend to remember their meals, but they don't remember their snacks. So you'll get statistics that say, oh, the average calorie intake in the USA is like around 2,500 calories a day. The reason I trust the 3,500 value is 1, we know people underreport, and 2, this is based on food availability data. So they can look at how much food is produced in the United States, what the waste is, and they can come up with a pretty accurate consumption number. Okay? This is way less subjective than, hey Bob, what'd you eat yesterday? Oh, I had a sandwich. And no. This is much more empirically led data. So I tend to be much more confident in that higher number, especially knowing what we know with people underreporting. And even, by the way, even professionals, even dietitians underreport their caloric intake by about 10%. So this happens across the board. So do I think that people are actually consuming 2,500 calories per day on average in the USA? No, I do not. I think 3,500 is much more accurate. And I think a lot of this increased calorie intake is due to the fact that ultra-processed foods are very energy dense, very tasty, very cheap, very available. You know, we had ultra-processed foods 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. We had cakes, cookies, ice cream. We had these foods. We had very energy dense foods. So what's the difference? Well, I think one of the biggest differences is the fact that over the last 30, 40 years, the accessibility of ultra-processed hyperpalatable foods has become way more. So before, say 1950s, if you wanted cakes, cookies, treats, you had to go down to the supermarket, or you had to go to the cake store or the candy store or whatever it was. There was a barrier to entry to get there. It took some amount of effort. And then when we hit, really an inflection point with the obesity crisis, in the 1980s, that's when you started seeing these ultra-processed foods show up, not just in grocery stores, but gas stations. There's candy machines in a lot of different public places, street vendors. It became much easier to go and buy ultra-processed foods at the drop of a hat. Now, the year 2025, I don't even have to leave my house. I can just jump on Amazon and order whatever my heart desires straight to my doorstep, and I can get it same day. And if I don't want to wait, I just get on that DoorDash. So not only can I get access to all the ultra-processed hyperpalatable food I want, I literally only have to lift a finger to do it. I don't have to walk downstairs. I don't have to get in my car. There is almost no barrier to entry now. And if I really, really want to be lazy, if I don't want to lift a finger, just hit that subscribe and save on Walmart, Amazon. I think Instacart even has it. You can just have a subscription to the stuff you like, and it will come to your door at the frequency that you want. You literally don't have to do anything. And even Walmart now, I saw Walmart, you don't have to put your own groceries up. They'll come in your house and put your groceries up for you. So you literally don't have to do anything anymore. Now that's giving the background of ultra-processed food and why it's a problem with the obesity crisis. Now let's talk about protein, because this study was looking at ultra-processed foods in the context of high protein. Well, protein is a unique macronutrient. It is the only nitrogen-containing macronutrient we have. So protein has what's called an amine group on it, which is why we call amino acids, the building blocks of protein, is why they're called amino acids, because they have an amine group. So that amine group contains nitrogen. And nitrogen is extremely important from a structural perspective. So amino acids, because of the way they are structured, they are used to make virtually every tissue in the body. So your muscle, made out of amino acids. Liver, amino acids. Heart, amino acids. Brain, amino acids. Like all your organs are primarily made out of amino acids. And I say they're made out of amino acids, but they're made out of protein. And proteins are just long chains of amino acids. And proteins, these chains of amino acids, based on the amino acid sequences, will fold into different shapes. And these shapes of the proteins give them their bioactivity. So let's take, for example, insulin. So insulin is a hormone that will bind to a cell. And in the case of, like, let's say skeletal muscle cells, insulin will bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. And it binds to the receptor because of the shape of the insulin molecule. Think about a lock and key, all right? And the receptor, by the way, is also made out of protein, right? It has folded into a certain shape. So that quote unquote docking of that insulin molecule with the insulin receptor causes what we call a conformational change. And that initiates a signaling cascade that ends in basically these things called GLUT4 receptors, which are sequestered in the nucleus of the cell. They translocate, meaning they move from the nucleus of the cell to the cell surface, and it allows glucose into the cell. So that's how insulin gets glucose into muscle cells. That's just one example, okay? But it is the shape of these proteins that gives them their bioactivity. And this goes for any protein. And the shape is determined by the amino acid sequence, because depending on the amino acid sequence, it will fold into a different shape. And these shapes would not be able to be made without the nitrogen component of these proteins. So nitrogen is an extremely important molecule, and we have a certain requirement for protein and essential amino acids. Essential meaning you cannot produce them endogenously, you have to get them through the diet. And so protein is unique in that. You can't get it from fats, you can't get it from carbohydrates. And in fact, if you didn't consume any dietary fat, but you had enough protein and carbs, you probably wouldn't feel real great, but I don't think you would die, most likely. Although there's cases of rabbit poisoning, they call it. But you can produce fat endogenously. If you only consumed fat and protein, you wouldn't die because your body can produce carbohydrates endogenously. But if you didn't consume any protein, just carbohydrates and fats, it would probably take you a really long time to die because your body can recycle amino acids. But eventually over time, my guess is you would probably die. And if you didn't, you would have severe health problems because you just would not be able to maintain your body's tissues. So all that to say, protein intake is very important for tissue remodeling. But the amount of protein you need to maintain your tissues is relatively low. The RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram, which for somebody who's about 93 kilograms like me, that winds up being, around 75 grams of protein per day. Okay, so not a lot of protein. I personally consume about 230, 240 grams of protein a day. But that amount of protein, that RDA, is basically used to maintain what's called nitrogen balance. So let's talk about that real quick and why the RDA is where it is. So nitrogen balance is very simply, is the amount of nitrogen you ingest equal to or greater than the amount of nitrogen you excrete? And if it is greater than the amount of nitrogen you're excreting, then you're in a positive nitrogen balance and you can maintain or build tissue. Now, this is relatively easy to measure in a laboratory. You just look at how much nitrogen someone is getting or a subject is getting, and then you look at how much is coming out in the feces and urine. And if you want to be really detailed, sweat, because you do lose some nitrogen through sweat. So if you look at those three things, you can see, okay, this is how much nitrogen they took in. This is how much came out. Are they in a positive nitrogen balance or not? But recently, probably last 40 years, 30 years, we have seen some benefits to high protein diets, especially when it comes to body composition. High protein diets improve lean mass accrual, especially with resistance training. As an adjunct to resistance training, they can improve lean mass accrual. They improve lean mass retention when on a fat loss diet. So if you are on a weight loss diet and you don't exercise, the amount of weight you lose from fat mass versus lean mass is around 30 to 40% you will lose from lean mass and 60 to 70% you will lose from fat mass. If you don't even have to exercise, but if you do a high protein diet, you'll reduce the amount of lean mass you lose and increase the amount of fat mass you lose by about 10%. So it goes from 60, 40, 70, 30 to about 70, 30, 80, 20. And because of this kind of nutrient partitioning, you also tend to get better loss of fat mass on a high protein diet. You don't necessarily lose more weight, but the weight you do lose, a greater percentage of it is from fat mass compared to lean mass. High protein diets have also been shown to possibly improve satiety, and that appears to be through a decrease in a hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hormone that, when it goes up, stimulates appetite and food intake, and increased levels of a hormone called CCK. And CCK is a hormone that you secrete that essentially tells your body that you're full and you can end the meal. And high protein diets have been shown to increase GLP-1 secretion. And again, we know that like the most effective weight loss drugs in existence are GLP-1 mimetics. Now, I want to be very clear. High protein diets do not do what GLP-1 drugs do. Okay, there is a big difference here. And the difference is GLP-1, the endogenous protein you produce, it has a half-life of a few minutes. GLP-1 mimetics have been modified so that their half-life is much, much longer. So the effect of a GLP-1 mimetic is way more powerful on appetite than a high-protein diet is. I just want to put that out there because I've seen some people on social media say, well, you don't need Ozempic, you just need a high-protein diet. It's the same thing. It's not the same thing. High-protein diet can be useful, absolutely, but it's not the same thing as GLP-1 mimetic. Additionally, high-protein diets have been shown to increase energy expenditure. And it's been proposed a few different ways that this happens. In fact, Initially, the increase in energy expenditure or calories burned from protein was thought to be due to greater energy required during digestion and absorption and metabolism. And now we think that it actually might be due to its effects on protein turnover. So when you eat high protein, your body stimulates a process called muscle protein synthesis. And when muscle protein synthesis is stimulated, that is an energy dependent process. It requires ATP, it requires energy. And when protein synthesis goes up, protein degradation also tends to go up. And there's evidence that this increase in synthesis and degradation, even though in a fed state with high protein, synthesis exceeds degradation, they both go up. There's evidence that this is kind of like a futile cycle. So basically you're quote unquote wasting energy doing this, which in terms of fat loss is a good thing. This increased turnover is a good thing. And in fact, we did a very tightly controlled study in rats. I'm not going to hide that. It was in rats. But rodents are actually a very, very good model for muscle protein metabolism. And most of the studies looking at muscle protein metabolism in rats translate well to humans. But we did a very tightly controlled study where we did see that body composition was affected by the source of protein, with sources of protein that had higher leucine contents were better at stimulating muscle protein synthesis, and we saw better body composition outcomes with that. And we also saw that when you stimulate protein synthesis, we observed a decline in cellular ATP in the short term. And so this process of stimulating muscle protein synthesis is not just important for building muscle, but it looks like it burns more calories as well. So again, high protein diets appear to have benefits in terms of increasing muscle protein synthesis, improving lean mass accrual, lean mass retention on a diet, better satiety, and increasing the amount of calories you burn every day. In fact, there's something called the thermic effect of food. And the thermic effect of food is basically the amount of calories you need to put in to digestion, absorption, metabolism of a macronutrient to get the calories out. Okay, so our bodies are kind of like cars or internal combustion engines, meaning you don't just put gas in your car and all of a sudden it goes. You have to put energy in to get the energy out of that gas. So you have a starter and you have a battery, and that energy allows you to get the energy out of the gas. And that's kind of like food. Your body has to put a little bit of energy in to get energy out. Fats, for example, have a TEF, or thermic effect of food, of 0 to 3%, meaning if you eat 100 calories from fat, on average, you're going to net out about 97 to 100 calories. Carbohydrates, on average, have a thermic effect of food of about 5 to 10%. So if you eat 100 calories from carbohydrate, you net out about 90 to 95 calories. Protein is closer to 20 or 30%. So if you eat 100 calories from protein, on average, you net out 70 to 80. So again, there's a thermogenic effect of protein that may also be useful for fat loss and body composition. There's also a hypothesis out there called the protein leverage hypothesis. And this hypothesis states that obesity may be, at least in part, be able to be explained by the fact that protein has been diluted in the diet over the last few decades. So while absolute protein intakes have not dropped, I think they've actually gone up a little bit, protein as a percentage of calories in the diet has declined. And the protein leverage hypothesis states that we will increase food intake to reach a certain level of protein in the diet. So if protein is low, we will overconsume calories to get it. So one of the supports for this hypothesis is that while absolute protein intakes have not decreased, we have had to eat more calories to get that amount of protein because it has been diluted in the diet. And there's this hypothesis that we have these quote unquote protein stats or sensors in the body that are trying to maintain homeostasis, trying to make sure we get enough protein in. So that is the protein leverage hypothesis. And it is also supported by all the things we just said: effects on satiety, energy expenditure, muscle protein synthesis, and body composition. Now, the purpose of this study was to examine diets that were ultra-processed in the context of either normal amount of protein at 13% of calories or high protein at 30% of calories, and to see if there was any difference on body composition, energy expenditure, energy intake, and how much validity there may be to the protein leverage hypothesis. Many people ask me what supplements I take, and that's easy. I take the supplements that I formulate and created for my supplement line, Outwork Nutrition. You see, I started Outwork Nutrition because I was frustrated by the lack of transparency in the supplement industry. So many companies were using proprietary blends to hide the fact that they were drastically underdosing their products. And as a research nutrition scientist, I know what having a proper dosage means when it comes to these ingredients. And I knew that many of these companies were just ripping people off. That's when I decided to create my own line of science-based supplements that were good enough to support my training. As someone who has won 5 national titles and 2 world titles in powerlifting and set 2 world records in powerlifting and trains for 2 to 3 hours a day, I needed supplements that would support my hard, intense training and recovery. All Outwork Nutrition products are based on the latest scientific evidence, and every ingredient is included at the proper clinical dose for maximum effectiveness. We provide links to all the scientific research and ingredients and claims on our website, so you don't have to take our word for it. You can read it for yourself. No proprietary blends, no BS marketing hype, no empty promises. Just science-backed supplements to support your hard work. Click the link in the show notes or head on over to outworknutrition.com and sign up for our email list to get 10% off your first order. So now we're going to go through the methods. So let's talk about the subjects. There was 24 subjects, 11 men, 13 women. Now I know right now people are going to go, 24 subjects, who cares? Okay, so as we're going to discuss, this was a very tightly controlled study, very tightly controlled. And the more tightly you control a study, the lower subject number you require. So in a metabolic ward, which this study was, you don't need very many subjects because you are controlling things so tightly. And from a practical perspective, these studies are extremely expensive to carry out. So typically, if you want a very, very highly controlled study in humans, you're just not going to have that many people, and it's not going to be for very long. If you want something that's tightly controlled over a long period of time with a lot of subjects, you have to do it in lab rats. That's basically your option. So this study was a crossover design, meaning that people consumed both diets. They had a washout period in between each, and the order they consumed them in was random. So half the people consumed the normal protein diet first, and half the people consumed the high protein diet first. And the reason they randomize it like this is so that, one, you increase your power, because now basically each subject is 2 data points, right? Because they are acting as their own control. And when you're doing things like a paired t-test in statistics, when you have people acting as their own control, it basically makes the statistics more powerful. And by making the order in which they consume the diets random, with half the people consuming the normal protein diet first and half the people consuming the high protein diet first, what you're doing is ensuring that if there are any kind of bleed over effects in the second diet from the first, that they're equally distributed. So any difference between the 2 treatments you can still assume is due to the treatment and not some kind of crossover effect. Now let's talk about the diets. Both diets were about the same percentage of ultra-processed foods. About 84% of the calories were from ultra-processed foods. That's crazy. That's crazy. The normal protein diet was 13% protein, 46% carbohydrate, and 41% fat. The high protein diet was 30% protein, 29% carbohydrate, and 41% fat. This is really important because basically they have just swapped out protein and carbohydrate. They didn't change the fat content, which I think is smart. I think that's smart because you're testing now 2 things. You're testing carbohydrate, the low carbohydrate of the diet, and the high protein of the diet, even though you could argue that results may be skewed because you have a hard time saying, well, was it because of the high protein or was it because of the low carbohydrate or was it a combination of both? But at the end of the day, you're trying to move around puzzle pieces, and if you move one, you have to move another. And this was all done in a metabolic ward where all of their food intake would be tracked and they would be subject to direct telemetry. Basically, they're in a room where based on the amount of heat they give off, as well as the CO2 they expire, the oxygen they consume, basically they can very reliably determine what their total energy expenditure is in a day. Now, they were allowed to consume these diets ad libitum, so again, as much as they wanted, over a 54-hour period. And the protein intakes on an absolute level in the normal protein diet were about 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And in the high protein group, they're about 3.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. Both diets were designed to be equal in palatability, fiber, fat, and food type. Okay, so that's really important. All right. Very similar palatability, very similar fat, fiber. Fiber is important because fiber is satiating. Okay. Palatability is important because if one of the diets is more palatable than the other, then people may overconsume it, not because it's lower or higher protein, but because of the palatability overall. And palatability boils down to a lot of things. People say, oh, it's sugar, it's this, it's that. No, it's sugar, fat, salt, texture, mouthfeel. All those things matter for palatability. So they designed them to be equal in palatability, which is very, very important. Now the next question. Only 54 hours. That's like 2 days and 6 hours. Again, these studies are very expensive to conduct. And when you are trying to directly measure energy expenditure, you're basically keeping these people in food jail for that period of time. If you want to get a lot of subjects, which by the way, 24 subjects in a metabolic ward trial is pretty darn good. A lot of metabolic ward trials are like 6, 10 people. So getting this number of subjects is actually pretty good. But if you're trying to get them to do it for a month, for example, I mean, good luck. You're literally housing these people for a month. People have jobs, people have lives, people have families. Many times when it comes to metabolic ward stuff, you're looking at very short term. But again, 54 hours is all the time they need to compare energy intake and energy expenditure. So let's go to the results section. They found that people overate on both diets. So they overconsume calories above their maintenance calories. On the normal protein, normal carb diet, they overfed by 32% over their maintenance. So for example, somebody like me, my maintenance is like 3,400 calories per day. So if I overate by a third, I'd be eating like almost 4,500 calories per day. Okay. Like 1,000 calorie surplus. It's pretty hefty. But on the high protein, low carb diet, they only overate by 18%. So for someone like me, that would be more like a 600 calorie surplus. Now, still a pretty hefty surplus, no doubt about it. But again, comparatively, it was a lot lower surplus. On an absolute basis, on average, people who were eating the high protein, low carb, ultra processed diet ate 196 calories less than people who were eating the normal protein, normal carb diet. They also found that meal duration was slightly longer with the high protein, low carb diet versus the normal protein diet. And the eating rate and energy intake rate were slower in the high protein, low carb diet. They ate fewer bites, but had more chews per bite. Now, I don't exactly know what all that means in terms of like how it fits into the puzzle, but it probably does help if people are eating something slower compared to faster. They also found that the 3-hour post-meal area, what we call area under the curve, meaning if you measure how much of a hormone or whatever is secreted over a period of time, based on the time points, you can do an integration and determine what is the overall quote unquote area under the curve. So area under the curve is more reflective of how much of a certain compound or hormone is present in the body over a period of time compared to just measuring like 1 or 2 points in time. So the 3-hour post-meal area under the curve for ghrelin was lower on the high-protein, low-carb, ultra-processed diet compared to the normal protein, normal carb diet. Additionally, the 3-hour post-meal area under the curve for peptide YY or PYY was higher in the high-protein, low-carb diet versus the normal protein, normal carb diet. And PYY is a satiety hormone that's been shown to decrease calorie intake. And previously, high-protein diets have been shown to increase PYY. So all this stuff is tracking so far based on what we know about high-protein diets. Now, here's an interesting little tidbit for the low-carb community because they hate insulin. 24-hour insulin secretion was actually higher in the high-protein, low-carb diet, which I'd like to point out is in direct opposition to the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, which we will discuss in another episode. But the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity predicts that insulin will increase hunger, cause people to overeat. So on a high-protein diet, in this study, insulin was higher over a 24-hour period, and people actually ate less than the comparative diet. So this is in direct opposition to what the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity predicts. Now, again, this may surprise some people, but there are other studies showing that high-protein meals, high-protein diets can increase insulin in spite of the fact that they cause more fat loss. 24-hour energy expenditure was also greater on the high-protein diet compared to the normal protein diet. It was about 128 calories more. Your overall energy balance, so you have with the high-protein, low-carb diet compared to the normal protein, normal carb diet, you had 196 calories less intake, and you had 128 calories more expenditure. That is a swing overall of 324 calories in energy balance. So if you add the lower energy intake and the increased energy expenditure, it's an over 300 calorie per day difference. That's pretty substantial. Now, again, they both overfed. These people on the high protein diet would have been gaining weight, but they would have gained less weight than the people on the normal protein diet. They also measured what they called protein balance, which is basically the amount of protein consumed versus oxidized, I believe. And they saw that protein balance was greater on the high protein, low carb diet versus the normal protein, normal carb diet. And fat balance was also lower in the high protein, low carb diet versus the normal protein, normal carb diet. And in fact, I don't think fat balance was actually different from zero. I think it was like neutral in the high protein, normal carb diet. Now, fat balance is the amount of fat that you consume versus the amount that you oxidize or burn. And so if you are in a positive fat balance, over time, you will gain body fat. If you are in a neutral fat balance, you won't gain body fat. And if you're in a negative fat balance, you lose fat. So the high protein group was in a positive protein balance and basically a neutral fat balance, which again suggests that there could be a nutrient partitioning effect to high protein diets compared to normal protein diets. Now, this is a very short-term study, and we don't know if that would have actually produced long-term differences. We can't extrapolate out that far. But at least based on these shorter-term surrogate measures, it appeared to be trending that direction. Shockingly or not shockingly, the sensation of fullness was greater on the high-protein diet compared to the normal protein diet. Now let's go to the discussion. We saw both diets induced overfeeding. The high-protein diet induced less overfeeding than the normal protein diet and greater energy expenditure, which resulted in a better overall energy balance, a lower energy balance compared to the normal protein diet. Now, what was really interesting is they also looked at the effects of the run-in diet. Now, the run-in diets were the same diets, but instead of 84% ultra-processed food, they were 45% ultra-processed food. And this actually produced a much more pronounced difference between the high-protein, low-carb diet and the normal protein, normal carb diet. Both of these outcomes support the protein leverage hypothesis, at least in part. And we have other studies that show that protein leverage doesn't explain the obesity epidemic in its entirety. It can't explain that fully. But both of these results support the protein leverage hypothesis that if you increase the protein concentration in the diet, that people eat less food. And that also jives with the idea that we have this protein or nitrogen stat, quote unquote, sensor in probably our brain that looks at, okay, are we getting enough protein? Should we be eating more or less? And the fact that there was a more pronounced difference on the run-in diet versus the test diet with high protein versus normal protein suggests that perhaps protein leverage plays a bigger role at lower intakes of ultra-processed foods. Having a certain threshold of ultra-processed foods in the diet overrides this protein stat or protein leverage more so than at lower levels. Again, it's still having more protein, reduced intake, even at high levels of ultra-processed foods. It's just that the effect was less pronounced. And I think it would have been really interesting to see what would have happened with long-term body composition following these two diets. Again, I am not criticizing the researchers for only having 54 hours of a test period, because you got to remember, you're not just testing the test period. It's not like the total study duration was 54 hours. You have the familiarization period with the subjects. You have the run-in diet period. You have a washout period. You have the period of them consuming one test diet followed by a washout period. Then you have them switching to the other test diet, and then you have follow-up analysis. So this is probably well over a week, is my guess, in terms of total duration that each person was involved. And so it is difficult to recruit subjects for those kinds of studies because they are so controlled and they are so restrictive. Would you want to live in food jail for a week, not being able to eat the foods that you want, getting poked and prodded all the time, not being able to leave? Because I don't think you would. But nevertheless, would have been interesting to see with this level of control, if they did this for say 4 weeks, would we actually see, nutrient partitioning effects? And if we did, this would be in line with some other studies with high protein diets suggesting a nutrient partitioning effect. I mean, we discussed this in some of the studies in the introduction that I cited, because when you use a high protein diet, there is a nutrient partitioning effect where you are losing more weight from fat versus lean tissue. And there's also been studies kind of eating at maintenance or even overfeeding with high protein diets, showing that at maintenance, there can be a body compositioning effect where you might gain some lean mass and lose some body fat. And then overfeeding, people who overfeed on a high protein diet, they still gain body fat, but they gain a greater amount of lean mass than people who are eating a low protein or normal protein diet. Now let's talk about the conclusions of the study. I mean, basically, you've heard me say it already. We're just recapping here. High protein diets at low, moderate, or high intakes of ultra-processed foods help reduce energy intake and increase energy expenditure. And this may help lead to a better overall energy balance in terms of not over-consuming food as much. But if you consume enough ultra-processed food, even if you are eating a high-protein diet, it is likely that you will overconsume calories. Now, the effect of this high-protein diet on energy intake is probably due to its effects on some of these hunger hormones like ghrelin and PYY and CCK, and it appears that high-protein diets may have a bit of a nutrient partitioning effect towards lean tissue and away from fat tissue. So what does all this mean for you? I think my takeaway from this study would be that protein intake matters at any intake of ultra-processed foods. And while it may not be sufficient to offset the overeating of ultra-processed foods, it at least has a tempering effect. So if the protein leverage hypothesis could completely explain obesity, then we would expect that if we got protein high enough, people would not overfeed. And we didn't see that. People still overfed, but they overfed less than with the normal protein diet, which suggests that the protein leverage hypothesis is at least in part valid. But there's probably other factors at play: energy density, food palatability overall. And so I think high protein diets are typically a good idea because of all the reasons we just discussed. But it's important to point out that if you're eating a lot of ultra-processed foods, the high protein probably will not be enough to offset the increased energy that you will likely consume from ultra-processed foods. Now, again, if you guys like this research breakdown, make sure you subscribe to my Research Review Reps, where we review 5 studies like this every week and break it down in a way that's easy to understand. You can find the link there in the show notes. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will catch you next time.